Are you comfortable? Let your heavy shoulders drop, sink deeply into your mattress, and allow the quiet of the night to wrap around you. Tonight, we are not going to look at the bright, chaotic screens of the present. Instead, we will close our eyes and let the river of time carry us backward into the shadows of a deeply misunderstood era. But before we drift into the past, let us pause for a fleeting moment in the present. As of March 2026, the world still holds its breath in quiet apprehension. Somewhere in the dark, vast waters of the Strait of Hormuz, tensions between the United States and Iran ripple through the cold ocean air. Global oil prices tremble, and old alliances murmur in the corridors of power. And in the minds of many, a familiar, comforting thought arises. It is the United States, after all, the giant of the modern world. They do not lose. That is. Yet, history is a patient teacher, whispering a different truth. Tonight's journey begins with that very thought. There was a time, a deeply humbling chapter in the grand tapestry of human events, where the giant did not win. It was not a lack of steel, nor a shortage of young men sent across the ocean, nor an absence of devastating firepower. They poured the weight of a superpower into a narrow strip of jungle, and yet they could not find the door to leave. This is the story of the Vietnam War. We will walk slowly from the very first quiet footstep into the muddy waters, all the way to the desperate beating of helicopter blades lifting off a rooftop in Saigon. We will not seek to judge or point fingers. Instead, as we breathe slowly in the dark, we will try to understand the tragic paradox, how a nation so incredibly strong could become trapped in a maze with no exit. The questions asked in those dense, rain-soaked forests decades ago are the exact same questions echoing in our world today. The door to war is always deceptively low and easy to step through, but the exit is unimaginably narrow. Let us travel back, long before the first American combat boots touched the wet, tropical soil. The tragedy did not erupt out of nowhere in the 1960s. The seeds were planted deep in the earth of the 19th century. Imagine the scent of heavy monsoon rain falling on the broad green leaves of the Indo-Chinese peninsula. For nearly a century, Vietnam was held tightly in the colonial grip of France. Generations lived and died under the shadow of foreign rule. But as the ashes of the Second World War settled across the globe, a quiet awakening began to stir. The old empires were exhausted. In 1945, a man named Ho Chi Minh stood before a hopeful crowd, his voice carrying over the warm breeze, declaring the birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. But empires do not let go easily. The French, desperate to reclaim their fading glory, returned. Thus began the First Indochina War. It was a slow, grueling conflict. For the French, it was a desperate attempt to hold on to a ghost of their colonial past. For the Vietnamese, it was the culmination of decades of silent suffering, a fierce desire to finally own the soil beneath their feet. The turning point came in the spring of 1954 in a remote, mist-shrouded valley called Dien Bien Phu. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the distant, muffled thud of artillery echoing through the rugged mountains. The French forces, entrenched in the muddy, rain-filled valleys, found themselves completely surrounded. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and exhausted despair. When the guns finally fell silent, the French Empire in Indochina had effectively crumbled. The surrender at Dien Bien Phu was not just a military defeat. It was the quiet, melancholic end of an era. The dust of battle shifted to the cold, echoing marble halls of Geneva, Switzerland. There, in 1954, diplomats in heavy woolen suits sat around polished oak tables to carve up the fate of a nation thousands of miles away. They drafted the Geneva Accords, drawing an invisible, arbitrary line across the map at the 17th parallel. The North would be governed by Ho Chi Minh's communist forces, while the South would be led by a regime heavily backed by the West. It was supposed to be a temporary wound, a fleeting division. The diplomats promised that in exactly 2 years, in 1956, nationwide elections would be held, to sew the country back together. But in the grand chessboard of history, promises are often washed away by fear. Notice one crucial detail in this quiet room in Geneva. The United States did not sign the agreement. The world was plunging deep into the freezing paranoia of the Cold War. In Washington, behind thick oak doors and under the warm glow of desk lamps, policymakers looked at the map of Southeast Asia with growing dread. They were captivated by a concept known as the Domino Theory. They believed, with a terrifying certainty, that if the northern half of Vietnam fell to communism, the rest would follow. Laos would fall, Cambodia would collapse, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, they would all tip over, one by one, like a row of heavy, silent dominoes in the dark. Driven by this profound anxiety, the United States quietly began to prop up the Southern regime. It did not start with a grand declaration of war. It started as a whisper, a few economic packages discreetly wired across the ocean, a handful of military advisors arriving in civilian clothes, quiet training sessions in the humid afternoons. The official language was soothing, diplomatic, reassuring. "We are not fighting," they said. "We are simply helping a friend stand on their own." And what of the grand elections promised for 1956? They faded into the mist. Both the South Vietnamese government and their American allies looked at the political landscape and realized they could not guarantee the outcome. The uncertainty was too great, the risk too profound. So, the elections were indefinitely postponed. The country remained broken in two. This is how the great tragedies of our world often begin, not with a sudden, deafening explosion, but with a series of quiet, calculating decisions made in comfortable rooms. A missed election, a small deployment of advisors, the shipment of rifles, the offering of an umbrella of security. When the first American personnel stepped off their planes into the heavy heat of South Vietnam, not a single soul among them believed they were walking into a quagmire that would eventually consume hundreds of thousands of lives. The structure of intervention is a delicate spiderweb. At first, the threads are almost invisible, easily brushed aside. But every small move, every minor commitment, spins another thread, wrapping tighter and tighter until the giant finds itself completely paralyzed, unable to move forward and unable to turn back. As we reflect on the quiet beginnings of this immense tragedy, let your breathing slow down. The winds of the past are blowing gently through the empty halls of Geneva, carrying the faint, distant echo of a storm that is yet to come. Neo Nu Khan to Seen Truk, unable to move forward and unable to turn back. As the late 1950s melted into the 1960s, the suffocating heat of the Cold War settled heavily over South Vietnam. In the bustling capital of Saigon, the air was thick with the scent of exhaust fumes, blooming jasmine, and unspoken fear. The southern regime was led by Ngo Dinh Diem, a man who ruled from behind the towering iron-willed gates of the presidential palace. But outside those heavy stone walls, the foundation of his government was slowly turning to dust. Diem's rule was harsh, rigid, and deeply alienated from the very people he claimed to protect. He silenced political opposition with an iron fist. Corruption spread quietly, like damp rot through the wooden beams of an old house. And most profoundly, his regime alienated the vast Buddhist majority. Try to visualize the quiet, somber courtyards of the ancient pagodas. The scent of sandalwood incense hung heavy in the still air, soon to be replaced by the bitter, stinging smoke of desperate protests. Monks sat in absolute, terrifying silence on the burning asphalt, their robes the color of fading autumn leaves. The regime was bleeding its own people's trust, drop by drop. Here we find our first paradox of the night. The tragedy of absolute control is that the tighter a ruler clenches their fist, the more the sand of loyalty slips through their fingers. While the political elites in Saigon focused their paranoid gaze on the cities, a different kind of storm was quietly gathering in the vast, emerald-green rice paddies of the countryside. In 1960, the National Liberation Front, widely known as the Viet Cong, officially formed in the shadows. They did not announce their presence with roaring trumpets or grand parades. Their war was a silent, creeping vine. Imagine the extreme foreground, thick, brown mud squelching beneath the bare feet of a farmer. In the midground, the endless expanse of a flooded rice field reflecting the blinding midday sun. In the far background, the dark, impenetrable tree line of the jungle. By day, these men and women were ordinary peasants, their backs bent in the grueling, quiet labor of the harvest. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the world in the silver, melancholic light of a crescent moon, those same calloused hands reached beneath the floorboards of their thatched huts. They unearthed rifles wrapped in heavily oiled cloth. They organized. They waited. They fought a war of patience, blending seamlessly into the very soil of the land. The United States watched this unraveling tapestry with growing, deep-seated anxiety. From the Eisenhower administration to the Kennedy administration, the response was to pour more weight onto the fragile scale. The number of military advisors steadily climbed. By 1962, thousands of American men in crisp, green uniforms were walking the humid, unfamiliar paths of Vietnam. They brought with them the staggering wealth of an empire. They brought roaring helicopters that tore through the quiet skies, heavy artillery, and endless logistical support. But in the quiet hours of the night, a chilling historical truth becomes apparent. You can export the finest, most devastating machinery of war across the ocean, but you cannot manufacture the political soul of a nation. The United States was severely overestimating the strength of its ally. If a government cannot win the hearts and the quiet allegiance of its own people, no amount of foreign steel can act as a substitute. By 1963, the internal rot reached its breaking point. In the damp, heavy monsoon rains of November, the quiet streets of Saigon trembled under the crushing weight of tank treads. A military coup, carried out by South Vietnamese generals, overthrew Ngo Dinh Diem. He was assassinated in the back of a dark, armored personnel carrier. History would later slowly peel back the curtains to reveal that the United States had known of the plot in advance, watching silently from the shadows. But the removal of one man did not bring peace. It brought a chaotic, dizzying carousel of instability. Coup followed coup. Generals traded the presidential seat like a hollow, meaningless prize, while the countryside slipped further into the silent grip of the Viet Cong. If you are resting your eyes right now, imagine the heavy, humid silence that follows a sudden, violent thunderstorm, only to realize, with a sinking heart, that the true hurricane has not yet made landfall. In August 1964, the axis of the world shifted not on land, but on the dark, restless waves of the ocean. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. Picture the extreme foreground, the cold, black water crashing against the cold steel hull of the USS Maddox, an American destroyer patrolling off the coast of North Vietnam. In the midground, the heavy, grey fog rolling over the ocean surface. On August 2nd, a brief, chaotic clash occurred with North Vietnamese torpedo boats. But it was the phantom night of August 4th that sealed the fate of millions. Inside the cramped, claustrophobic radar room of the destroyer, the air was thick with tension and the smell of ozone. Operators stared with wide, exhausted eyes at the glowing green radar screens. Blips appeared and vanished in the static. Sonar pinged wildly in the dark. Was it an incoming torpedo? Or was it merely the ghostly echoes of rough weather, the chaotic feedback of a restless sea? Decades later, the declassified Pentagon papers would lay bare a devastating truth. The intelligence of that second attack was profoundly flawed, a ghost born of confusion and fear. Even President Lyndon B. Johnson would later express deep, quiet doubts in the lonely halls of the White House. Yet, in the grand theater of history, doubt rarely stops the heavy gears of the war machine once they begin to turn. The news reached Washington, and the response was swift and overwhelming. The US Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution with near unanimous consent. It was a blank check, handing the president sweeping, unchecked power to wage war in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration. The quiet intervention was over. The floodgates of history had been thrown wide open. In March 1965, the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the tide on the pristine white beaches of Da Nang was shattered by a new sound. The deep, guttural roar of landing craft engines. The heavy ramps dropped into the shallow, foaming water. Thousands of United States Marines stepped onto the sand, their combat boots sinking into the wet earth. They were no longer just advisors in the shadows. The combat troops had arrived. The giant had fully stepped into the maze, completely unaware that the walls were already closing in behind them. Most wars, in their fragile, intoxicating beginnings, are wrapped in the comforting illusion of speed. When the young American soldiers first felt the suffocating, humid embrace of the Vietnamese air, the belief in the corridors of Washington was almost unshakable. They thought it would be brief. They believed that, with swift, overwhelming pressure, the enemy would fold. By the end of 1965, the number of troops swelled to roughly 180,000. A year later, it breached 300,000. By the agonizing peak in 1969, over 540,000 American military personnel were stationed across the burning landscapes of Vietnam. They brought an armada of technology that the world had never seen. Picture the extreme foreground, the scorching hot brass casings raining down onto the red soil. In the midground, the deafening, rhythmic chopping of Huey helicopter blades bending the tall, sharp elephant grass flat against the earth. Looming in the far background, the high-altitude silver bellies of B-52 bombers painting the sky with trails of white condensation. Throughout the duration of this slow-motion tragedy, the United States dropped more tonnage of bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than all the explosives utilized in the entirety of the Second World War combined. But here, as the smoke drifts lazily through the jungle canopy, we encounter a profound historical paradox. The giant possessed the absolute, undeniable mastery of the sky. Yet, they were fighting an enemy who had mastered the earth. The United States military viewed the war from above. They looked down upon sprawling, two-dimensional maps spread across polished tables, drawing red circles, calculating coordinates, and measuring control by zones and fire bases. It was a war of geometry and overwhelming logistics. Conversely, the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong viewed the war not from a map, but from their living rooms, their backyards, and beneath the very graves of their ancestors. This single divergence in perspective explains the unbearable length of the suffering. To understand this, let us descend into the suffocating darkness of the earth. In the district of Chu Chi, just outside of Saigon, the Viet Cong carved out a staggering, hundreds of miles long network of subterranean tunnels. Imagine the extreme foreground, the damp, cold clay pressing tightly against the shoulders of a guerrilla fighter navigating the pitch-black corridor. Just behind them in the midground, a dimly lit, subterranean field hospital, smelling faintly of old iodine, sweat, and kerosene lanterns. Looming in the far background, completely muffled by feet of solid earth, the dull, rhythmic thudding of American bombs rearranging the surface of the world. If you are lying comfortably in the dark right now, feeling the soft weight of your blanket, listen closely to the steady rhythm of your own breathing. Try to imagine holding that breath while hiding silently in a hollowed-out root system, waiting for hours as foreign boots crunch the dried leaves just inches above your head. The high-tech bombers soaring through the clouds could erase entire forests, but they could not erase the quiet, terrifying endurance of the people beneath the soil. The dense, multi-layered jungle canopy, heavy with torrential monsoon rains and thick vines, swallowed the effects of the bombing. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast, complex web of dirt roads and hidden paths weaving through neighboring Laos and Cambodia, became the vital artery of the north. Despite relentless, earth-shattering airstrikes meant to sever this artery, the quiet flow of bicycles, wooden carts, and men carrying heavy sacks of rice and ammunition never truly stopped. Like water flowing around a stone, the resistance simply adapted. Because they could not hold territory in the traditional sense, the American command adopted a deeply flawed, ultimately tragic metric for success, the strategy of attrition, commonly known as the body count. When you cannot measure victory by land captured or cities conquered, you begin to measure it by the grim mathematics of death. The logic was cold and mechanical. If we kill them faster than they can replace their numbers, they will eventually lose the will to fight. So began the endless, exhausting cycle of search and destroy missions. Imagine a patrol moving through the highlands. In the extreme foreground, heavy, mud-caked combat boots sinking deep into the flooded rice paddies, the water warm and stagnant. In the midground, a silent, empty village of thatched roofs, the residents having fled into the tree line at the first sound of engines. In the far background, the endless, impenetrable green wall of the jungle, offering no answers and hiding every threat. The troops would sweep through, engage in sudden, terrifying bursts of violence, call in devastating artillery, and then they would simply leave. They would count the fallen, report the numbers up the chain of command, and fly back to their heavily fortified bases. But the moment the helicopters vanished over the horizon, the Viet Cong would quietly emerge from the shadows and reclaim the village. The land was never truly held. The tragedy of the body count was that it warped the very purpose of the war. When soldiers are pressured by a bureaucracy to produce numbers, the lines between an armed combatant and a terrified civilian begin to blur in the chaos of a firefight. Villages were burned. The heavy, indiscriminate use of firepower alienated the very rural population of the United States and the South Vietnamese government desperately needed to win over. Hearts and minds cannot be won from the barrel of a gun, nor can loyalty be purchased with the ashes of a burning home. The United States consistently won the conventional battles. Whenever the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong stood their ground in a traditional firefight, the overwhelming American firepower decimated them. The casualty ratios were heavily tilted in America's favor. But the slow, painful realization creeping into the minds of the generals was this: winning every battle does not equal winning the war. A modern, immensely powerful military found itself deeply uncomfortable, stripped of its greatest advantages. They were a giant, blindfolded, swinging a massive sword at a swarm of bees. The enemy fought only when they had the advantage, melting back into the shadows the moment the odds turned. The war stretched on, month after agonizing month, year after sorrowful year, while the death toll quietly ticked upward on both sides. And as the blood soaked deep into the Vietnamese soil, the tremors of this conflict began to travel across the vast ocean, reaching the quiet, manicured suburbs and university campuses of America. The war was about to open a second, entirely unexpected front, not in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but in the living rooms of the United States. In the early days, the American public quietly supported the intervention. It was framed as a noble, distant necessity to hold back the tide of communism. The news anchors read the government reports with steady, reassuring voices. President Lyndon B. Johnson stepped before the cameras, his heavy features set in a mask of grim determination, repeating a comforting mantra: "We are making progress. We are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel." But history is a master of tragic irony. Just as the illusion of control reached its peak, the ground beneath the giant's feet gave way. It was late January, 1968, the Lunar New Year, known as Tet. Traditionally, this was a sacred time of pause, a brief, silent truce where the heavy guns were laid to rest and families gathered to honor their ancestors. Imagine the extreme foreground, the red paper of burned firecrackers scattering across the damp pavement in the cool night air. In the midground, the darkened, quiet streets of Saigon, heavy with the scent of incense and blooming apricot flowers. In the far background, the deep, velvet blackness of a sky waiting for dawn. And then, the silence was shattered, not by fireworks, but by the coordinated, deafening roar of a massive, nationwide assault. The Tet Offensive had begun. In the absolute dead of night, North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong struck simultaneously at over 100 cities, towns, and military bases across South Vietnam. They even breached the heavy, fortified walls of the United States Embassy in Saigon, the very symbol of American invulnerability. From a purely military standpoint, the Tet Offensive was a devastating failure for the North. The general uprising they had hoped to spark among the southern population never materialized. The Viet Cong suffered catastrophic, almost insurmountable losses. The American and South Vietnamese forces repelled the attacks, reclaiming the lost ground with overwhelming, brutal firepower. But wars in the modern age are not fought solely with bullets, they are fought with images. While the military claimed a tactical victory, a profound, irreversible psychological defeat was playing out across the ocean. Imagine the extreme foreground, the cold, flickering blue light of a heavy wooden television set casting long, dancing shadows across a thick carpet. In the midground, an American family sitting in absolute, stunned silence on their sofa, their dinners growing cold. In the far background, the oppressive, heavy silence of a neighborhood realizing a terrible truth. They were watching the war, raw and unfiltered, right in their living rooms. They saw the embassy under siege. They saw chaotic, bloody street battles. And most hauntingly, they saw the infamous photograph of a South Vietnamese police chief executing a Viet Cong prisoner point blank on a Saigon street. The sheer brutality of that single, frozen moment echoed around the world, instantly shattering the carefully constructed narrative of a clean, righteous war. The trust was broken. If we are winning, the people whispered in the dark. How could the enemy launch such a massive, coordinated attack? The most trusted man in America, news anchor Walter Cronkite, looked into the camera with tired, sorrowful eyes. After visiting the ruins of the offensive, he delivered a quiet, devastating verdict. It seems now, more certain than ever, that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. Upon hearing this, President Johnson reportedly turned to his aides and muttered a sentence that would define the era. "If I have lost Cronkite, I have lost Middle America. You can win every firefight. You can hold the high ground. But when the political will of a nation fractures, the war is already lost." The year 1968 tore the United States apart from the inside. It was a year of profound sorrow. Assassinations rocked the country. Anti-war protests swelled from quiet campus sit-ins to massive, roaring demonstrations. Young men, terrified of the draft, burned their cards in defiance. Veterans returning from the humid jungles cast their hard-earned medals onto the cold marble steps of the Capitol, their faces etched with a grief too heavy to name. And the moral foundation continued to crumble. In 1969, the dark, horrifying truth of the My Lai massacre was exposed to the world. A moment where American troops had systematically murdered hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians in a quiet farming village. The shockwave of this revelation was paralyzing. Then came the Pentagon Papers in 1971, leaking the cold, bureaucratic truth that the government had known for years. The war was likely unwinnable, yet had continued to send thousands of young men into the meat grinder. The giant was bleeding, not just in the jungles, but in its own soul. A new president, Richard Nixon, entered the Oval Office with a promise to achieve peace with honor. He introduced a strategy called Vietnamization, the slow, deliberate withdrawal of American troops, shifting the heavy, suffocating burden of the ground war back onto the shoulders of the South Vietnamese army. But here lies the final, agonizing paradox of the deep dive. In his desperate attempt to end the war, Nixon actually expanded it. Imagine the extreme foreground, the heavy, gold-plated tip of a fountain pen scratching across a classified document in the dim light of the Oval Office. In the midground, the tense, silent faces of military advisors staring at a map of Southeast Asia. In the far background, beyond the thick glass windows, the muffled, relentless chanting of thousands of protesters pressing against the White House gates. To cut off the enemy's supply lines, Nixon authorized massive secret bombing campaigns in neutral Cambodia and Laos. The sky rained fire on hidden trails, destabilizing entire neighboring countries. leading to further tragedies that history still mourns today. When the American public discovered the invasion of Cambodia, the outrage boiled over into tragedy, culminating in the shooting of unarmed student protesters at Kent State University. The war to stop communism had turned into a war that was consuming America itself. Finally, after years of exhausting, bitter negotiations in Paris, accompanied by the brutal Christmas bombings of Hanoi, meant to force the North's hand, an agreement was reached. On the 27th of January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The United States would withdraw its remaining forces. The prisoners of war would come home. In March of 1973, the last American combat troops boarded their planes, leaving the humid, scarred earth of Vietnam behind. President Nixon declared it a peace with honor. The fighting for the Americans had officially ended. But as the heavy cargo doors closed and the engines roared to life, a quiet, devastating truth lingered in the empty barracks left behind. The peace was merely an illusion. The United States had not secured a victory. They had simply handed the overwhelming burden of an unfinished tragedy to an ally that could no longer stand on its own. After the American forces vanished into the clouds in 1973, South Vietnam was left entirely alone in the suffocating heat. The peace accords were merely a fragile piece of paper, fluttering in the winds of an impending storm. The fighting between the North and the South never truly stopped. But the lifelines of American military and economic support were rapidly severed. Back in Washington, a weary Congress passed the War Powers Resolution to strip the president's ability to wage unchecked war. The devastating Watergate scandal consumed the Capitol, ending in Richard Nixon's dramatic resignation in August of 1974. The giant had finally turned its back, exhausted and broken by its own internal demons. Observing this profound, chaotic paralysis across the ocean, the North Vietnamese forces began to mass their troops. In early 1975, they launched a massive, decisive offensive. They swept through the Central Highlands with terrifying speed. The South Vietnamese army, demoralized, outgunned, and abruptly stripped of the colossal air support they had relied on for a decade, collapsed faster than anyone in Washington had ever anticipated. Entire divisions dissolved into the panicked, fleeing civilian populations. Cities fell in rapid succession like dominoes, fulfilling the very prophecy the United States had feared so deeply at the beginning. By late April of 1975, the shadow of the Northern Army fell completely over the outskirts of Saigon. The American embassy, a fortress that had withstood the shock of the Tet Offensive, now found itself implementing a frantic, desperate evacuation plan. Operation Frequent Wind. This is the moment we reach the absolute bottom of the historical abyss. I want you to slow your breathing, close your eyes, and picture the absolute, suffocating despair of April 29th. Imagine the extreme foreground, a trembling hand reaching up, desperately gripping the chain-link fence of the American embassy, knuckles white with fear. In the midground, a chaotic, surging sea of thousands of terrified South Vietnamese citizens, pleading in the suffocating heat, hoping for a miracle that would never arrive. Looming in the far background, the heavy grey sky of Saigon, choked with the thick, oily black smoke of burning documents. And above it all, the deafening, frantic thumping of American helicopter blades. They landed on rooftops, overloaded with fleeing personnel, rising heavily into the sky and flying out toward the aircraft carriers, waiting in the dark waters of the South China Sea. On the morning of the 30th of April 1975, a North Vietnamese tank crashed violently through the heavy iron gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The war was over. The tragic irony of history is profound. The United States poured the blood of over 58,000 of its young men into the earth. They spent astronomical fortunes. They shattered the trust of their own people. Millions of Vietnamese, both soldiers and civilians from all sides, perished in the agonizing crossfire. And in the end, the giant had to watch the exact nightmare it had spent 20 years trying to prevent unfold right before its tired eyes. The final image of the Vietnam War was not a grand victory parade through a conquered capital. It was the frantic, desperate image of an evacuation. It was a giant, fleeing from the rooftop of an embassy, leaving behind millions of shattered lives. This deeply traumatic exit birthed the Vietnam Syndrome in the American psyche, a profound, paralyzing fear of foreign entanglements that would haunt their foreign policy for generations. 10, even decades later, through the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, the heavy ghosts of Vietnam still whisper in the halls of power. And so, we return to the quiet, anxious world of our present night in 2026. The tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, the quiet calculations of power. History is not a dusty, forgotten book. It is a mirror. It warns us, with quiet, devastating clarity, that stepping into a conflict is deceivingly easy. The door is always low, and the initial steps feel controlled and manageable. But once the structure of war is built, once the giant commits its weight, the cost of leaving becomes infinitely heavier than the cost of entering. A superpower, with all its terrifying military might, cannot simply manufacture an exit when it desires one. Wars are won or lost, not just on the battlefield, but in the fragile, shifting sands of political will, public trust, and time. Let these heavy lessons fade into the quiet night. The empires of the past have made their tragic mistakes, and the echoes have finally settled into the earth. The leaders of that era have long since passed into the shadows. Now, it is time for your mind to rest. Let the anxieties of our modern world dissolve into the darkness of your room. The past cannot be changed, and tomorrow is not yet written. All that exists right now is the slow, steady rhythm of your breathing. If this journey through the shadows of history has brought you a moment of quiet reflection, please gently leave a subscription to the channel. Close your eyes. I wish you a deeply peaceful sleep, and we will meet again in the quiet halls of the past tomorrow night.